So in this second session this morning, I want to come back to Jacob. We were with Jacob last night. We were with him last night as he left the Promised Land, because it wasn't the Promised Land at that point, it wasn't Israel at that point, but he left what is now Israel. He was on his way out. He was running away from his brother Esau because he just tricked him. And this morning we're 20 years later, and Jacob has been tricking his uncle. His name means trickster, twister, grasper. He's been giving his uncle Laban a bit of a difficult time. Although, to be honest, I think they were probably as bad as each other. And now Jacob is fleeing back. So he's heading back into the land of Israel. And as he approaches his homeland, he has this big encounter with God where he wrestles with this angel, possibly even with God himself. When you find that phrase in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord, it's quite difficult to work out. Is it an angel? Is it even some sort of expression, incarnation of God himself? It almost seems interchangeable. Sometimes the angel of the Lord speaks as if he's God. So theologically it's not easy to distinguish. And in that big and dramatic encounter, hopefully we'll discover some of the things that will connect with our own Christian life and our own encounters with God. We might not physically wrestle with an angel this weekend, but actually there are lots of common elements between our story and Jacob's. Sorry, Tim. So let's read it. So we're in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob is afraid because not only has he got Laban coming after him, his uncle, he's now facing Esau. He's facing the brother that he tricked 20 years earlier, not seen his brother in 20 years, and they parted on bad company, on bad terms. And Jacob hears that Esau's got 400 guys with him. And he thinks it's probably not a sort of celebration welcome party. This looks more like a small posse of militias who may well be about to chop me to pieces. That's the thought in Jacob's mind, and so he's afraid. It says, that night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And after he'd sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. And so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. "Twister, grasper." The man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and with men, and you've overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And then he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It's because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Don't worry about that. That's a weird bit. I'm not even going to attempt to explain it. So, Jacob, this is the son of the guy who was nearly killed before coffee. Okay? Just to put you in the picture, this is Isaac's son. His name means grasper, twister. He was the second born of two brothers, twins. His older brother Esau was born, and the Bible says, even as they were born, Jacob was grasping at his heel. And the firstborn son would always have the birthright in a family. In that culture, you can't imagine what that meant in our culture, but in that culture, such an important thing. And Jacob, if you know the story, not got time really to recount it, but he pulls a con trick on his dad, on Isaac, who is old and blind by this point, and makes Isaac think that he is Esau. He puts on a hairy costume because Esau was hairy. Jacob was smooth, and so he tricks Isaac into blessing him, into giving him the family blessing. He's a trickster. He's a twister. And Esau finds out, and he's angry, and Jacob runs for it. And it's on that run out of the family land that he has this vision that we saw last night of angels on this staircase. And works for 20 years with his uncle, Laban. And he's a twister and a manipulator with Laban, and eventually he upsets his uncle. And now he has to flee back, but now he's between the devil and the deep blue sea. He comes back to the edge of Israel, and he's got to face Esau, and he hears that Esau has got 400 men with him. And Jacob prays that God would help him, but he's still calculating and planning. So he sends Esau, it's a fantastically funny story really, he sends Esau gifts, camels, donkeys, sheep, in vast quantity, a vast wealth. But he sends them in groups. It's almost like you're going to have so much problem with these animals, your 400 men won't have time to think about killing me. They'll be herding because he sends one group and then he sends another group. I think he's trying to distract Esau as much as bargain with him. And then he splits his party up. Jacob has got, he's got 4 wives basically, Rachel and Leah, and each of them had a maidservant. This is what I said to somebody in coffee break. This is a very different culture, very different time. Well, it was you, it was. You can't just translate into today. So he's got 4 wives, 11 sons, probably a whole lot of daughters as well, and an whole entourage of animals and servants. So they can't be attacked easily. He splits them into 2 groups. So he's doing everything he can, humanly speaking, to protect his possessions, to buy Esau off, and eventually he's alone. He's left alone. And has he done enough? And it says a man comes and wrestled with him. We'll come back to that in a moment. Jacob is a grasper. And I want to think about the grasping part of his life, first of all, before we understand this encounter. Our address used to be paradise. You remember? There's an echo of it in your heart. Eden was the place where all our desires were legitimately met from the hand of God and in the presence of God. That was our address. That's where we were meant to live. It's where the first humans lived. But we were evicted. We were evicted because even in paradise we acted like it wasn't enough. I say we because Adam and Eve represent all of us. However you take the initial story is up to you, but the absolute fact is they represent all of us. And even in paradise we craved the illicit. We craved more than God was giving. And so we were evicted. And Genesis said God put those great cherubim at the entrance to Eden so that we could not get back in. But ever since, humanity has been trying to get back in. Or rather, to create our own alternative paradise. to arrange for our own blessing. The Tower of Babel is the next attempt, man's alternative route to heaven. Let's be like God, let's build this great city. We've been doing it ever since when Columbus discovered America in 1492. The European imagination was captured by this idea, this story of El Dorado, the city of gold, and men went searching for it. We are looking for paradise all the time. And you and I are the same. There's a yearning, an echo within us for paradise lost. And if we can't have God's version, then we are happy to create our own. Think of those magazines, Cosmopolitan, Home and Garden, Men's Health with a nice rippling body on the front. They are all alternative pictures of paradise. And the magazine says you can have it. You can get back in. It can be yours. Life is within your grasp. Shakespeare wrote, "My desires like cruel hounds hounds. My desires like cruel hounds ever since pursue me." Even as Christians, deep down, we're very often trying to construct our own paradise. Like Jacob, we grasp for what we want. We've got a desire for something. It's because we should be in Eden, but we're not. And that desire remains for intimacy, for pleasure, for adventure, for peace, for satisfaction. The desire isn't wrong. There's that knowledge deep within us that something is missing. That's not wrong. It's an echo of Eden. It's a reminder that we were made for more and for better. But what's wrong is the way that we try to get it now. What's wrong is the shortcuts we take, like Jacob, to get our blessing, to get our desires met, to get back into Eden. We have an incredible tenacity to make our own arrangements, whether it's work, home, church, hobbies. We're so often trying to construct our places of pleasure and satisfaction and relief and safety and control and peace, and often without God in them. We will make life work. We will make life deliver. We will be happy. We will get back into Eden, with or without God. God can wait. And that was Jacob. Grasping. I'll have the blessing. I'll lie for it. I'll cheat for it. And so often it's us too. Trying to make our own paradise. Trying to control our own world so that it's how we want it to be. We're all graspers in one way or another. Jacob can't wait for God. He can't let God be God. He can't submit to God. His hope, as the New Testament says, he's not set fully on the grace to be given him. He wants something now. Paradise now. El Dorado now. Heaven's just a backup plan. And often we're the same. Jacob's energy, like ours, is going into getting what pleasure he can out of life now. I'll have it now. Heaven's a long way off. Let's arrange for some blessing now. Let's see what I can get now. So he tricks the birthright, the blessing, out of his brother Esau. And then he runs and he's with his uncle Laban and he's calculating and grappling and grasping still, building up flocks and family to suit himself. He's a grasper, trying to create his own Eden, his own paradise. And so often, in one way or another, we can be the same. It's not that the desire is wrong. It's that we're happy to fulfill it without God's help so much of the time. And so then comes the discipline. Jacob finds it's always a struggle. This paradise that he's trying to create never quite delivers. You find that? You find that? You know, you decorated our hall and landing a while ago, made it all real nice. Then 2 weeks later I dropped a box out the loft, actually scraped all down the wallpaper. This paradise we're trying to create never quite delivers. And so Jacob has to run from his brother who wants to kill him. And then Laban tricks him into marrying the wrong girl. Now, why Jacob didn't notice on his wedding night, I'm not too sure. It's a funny story. It's a funny story, but whatever. Laban tricks him. This paradise that he wanted with Rachel, he ends up with Leah. He doesn't really love Leah. All the time he's trying to grasp and put it together and get it together and nail it down, and it just like a bar of soap squeezes out of his hand. Do you ever feel like that about life? And sometimes we say, God, are you with me? Because it feels like you're against me. And I'm sure Jacob said that. And you know what God said to Jacob? He said, yeah, I am against you. I'm your enemy. Whenever you try to do it your way, I'm your enemy. And unless you learn to come and get it from me, my way, then I'll go to any lengths to thwart the paradise that you're trying to build. Sometimes, you know, God is the divine thwarter. I'm not saying that every trial in life is arranged by God. Okay, I'm not saying that God made me drop the box out the attic to rip the wallpaper. I'm not saying that. But God will use circumstances to thwart our attempts to construct paradise on our own terms. I mean, he started that process the very day after we were evicted. Do you remember? He cursed the earth. He cursed human labour. He cursed human relationships. You might say, nasty God. Cursing people like that. No, that was God being merciful. That was God being kind. God must curse and take away the heaven that we try and create for ourselves. That self-made satisfaction, that self-made safety, that self-reliance, because it'll become our hell. It'll become our hell. If we try and make paradise without God, it'll become our hell. That's why God curses. He's thwarting. He's disciplining. He doesn't want us to build it on our own. He wants to be part of it. He says, yeah, your passion, your desire is good, but it's misplaced. We settle for the wrong things in the wrong place. And so Jacob has struggled with God. He's struggled against God all this time to arrange his own blessing, to steal it from Esau, to build an empire. And God has struggled to thwart him. But Jacob isn't learning. And so finally God brings him face to face with Esau and 400 men. God's like, all right, see what you do with that. Maybe you'll call on me now. And Jacob does, he prays. In the passage just before the one we read, he does pray. He says, oh God, help. But still, he's calculating and plotting and splitting his group up and sending gifts and camels and donkeys and trying to buy his way and grasp his way. Still, he's crafty grasping Jacob. So now the Lord has to up the discipline. And so we come to this struggle. Don't forget, Jacob has seen visions of angels. We thought about that last night. But it's not changed him. Ecstasy rarely changes us. Discipline does. He's seen his visions, but it's not changed him. Now God is going to come and pick a fight with Jacob. So it says that a man came and wrestled with Jacob. We discover this is the angel of the Lord, but maybe Jacob at first thought it was just a man. Maybe it's one of Esau's men come to block his way. And I think this fight is a real and physical fight, but that's not really the point. The real point is that it's a picture of what's been going on for the last 30 years in Jacob's life. This fight with God that God initiates is a picture of God's discipline. The struggle goes on till daybreak. That means it's an even match. This is a deep story. This is not about prayer, by the way. I know there's a verse in the New Testament that says about somebody wrestling with God in prayer. And we think, wrestle, 2 and 2, and we make 5. This is not about prayer. This is not Jacob wrestling with God in prayer. This is not about prevailing prayer. It's a picture of God's discipline. It says God came and wrestled with him. God picked this fight. God picked this fight. This isn't Jacob praying. God comes and wrestles with him. God initiates this fight. The wrestling is a picture of God's attempt to break down Jacob's self-reliance and Jacob's opposition and Jacob's trust in himself. This wrestling is a picture of God's attempt to break Jacob's confidence in his own resources and the life of the flesh. Jacob has to learn that instead of gaining by cleverness and grasping, that he needs to receive things from God's hand. Jacob fights back though. He resists. He continues to resist. That means God must be restraining himself here. You know, this is God in this fight, and it lasts all night. That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you have a fight with God. I mean, God should win, shouldn't he? Clearly here, God is restraining himself. Throughout Jacob's life, God's been restraining himself, not been breaking Jacob with a violent hit, but hoping that Jacob would admit defeat, waiting for Jacob's surrender, hoping that Jacob would let go of his manipulative ways and his grasping ways and let God be the provider. Do you know it's possible for God to be fighting with us and God not to be winning? It's possible for God to be fighting with us and God not to be winning because we're resisting. And all night Jacob resists. And all night God fights, and they're in a stalemate because Jacob won't submit. And God is so reluctant just to overpower him. And we're often in the same place. God is struggling with us. And he doesn't want to overpower us. He would rather we submit and accept defeat. But we struggle and we resist. God's been trying to bring Jacob to an end of himself all these years, but still he's fighting back. No, I'll have it my way. There's a verse in Isaiah, it says this: you were wearied by all your ways, but you would not say it is hopeless. That's what God says to mankind. You're wearied by all your ways. You're wearied by your attempts at paradise, but still you won't say it's hopeless. And come to God open-handed. We're tired of fighting God. It's tiring fighting God. If you're in that place today, it's time to submit. It's exhausting doing it your own way. It's exhausting fighting God. But so often we won't say, oh, it's hopeless, and surrender. So now God has to take more drastic measures. When we come to the disabling. Finally, it says that this assailant immobilizes Jacob. Finally, there is a blow that Jacob cannot resist. Perhaps at this point, Jacob realizes who it is. God uses extra power to defeat Jacob. He'd rather not have had to do that. He'd rather not immobilize you. He'd rather not disable us. It would have been easier if Jacob had just willingly surrendered. But eventually God must find a way to bring us to an end of ourselves because He loves us. He wants us to discover what we were made for, not just to plough on in our own way. To do that, He's got to bring us to an end of ourselves. He's got to bring us to a place of impotence. And if we keep struggling, then sometimes the touch is painful. And it was for Jacob. But even this blow, although a painful blow, it's a merciful blow. It's a kind blow. It's an invitation to trust. And it works, because now there's a change in this scene. And Jacob goes from resisting to clinging. And it's two very different things. There's a sudden shift in this battle that, having been disabled, now he holds on. Now at last, he's depending on God. Now at last, he's realised what's going on. And he's clinging and he says, I will not let you go until you bless me. He realises suddenly that he needs God. How slow I am in life. And maybe you too. We battle with things, we struggle with things, we try and put things together our own way, we ignore God. And it doesn't work out, and eventually we get to a place where we've just got to cling on to God and say, Lord, I need you. I need you. And that's the best place. And the sooner we get to that place, the better. The sooner we get to that place, the better. And Jacob gets there, and now he hangs on to the angel of the Lord. He says, well, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. He's finally switched from cunning to clinging. He's finally switched from resisting stubbornly to resting. And so this fight really is yes, it's a moment in time, but it's also symbolic of the whole of Jacob's life. How the crafty eventually becomes the conquered. God conquers him in the end. And he clings on for the blessing. I think there's a last screen that says blessed are you. How did you do that? You're not sat there. The blessing and the disablement come together. Jacob wins by losing. He asks for blessing and God gives it when he gets to that place of clinging and dependency. He's come to recognise that it's better to walk with a limp and have God's blessing than walk strong and upright and do it in your own strength. It's better to walk with a limp under God's blessing than to stride forward in our own strength. And the angel now asks him, what's your name? And, you know, if we're going to encounter God, we've got to be honest. Jacob says, my name is Jacob. There's confession there. He's admitting, yeah, I've been a twister and a grasper. That's my name. That's who I am. And we've all got to come to that place with God where we admit who we are. And then God gives him a new name. The play on words here is difficult to understand. God says your name shall be Israel because you fought with God. But Israel means God fights, literally. So there's a subtlety in that play on words that I can't quite get my head around, and most commentators can't either. Because literally Israel means God fights. But Jacob is given this name. And the angel says you've prevailed. But he had to surrender in order to prevail. He's won by losing. He's won the blessing, but only by finally surrendering to God. And if he'd surrendered a lot sooner, God wouldn't have had to give him the limp. And maybe sometimes in life we feel we've been disabled. in some way by some circumstance. Well, what we need, rather than whinging about that, to let it make us cling. To let that difficulty and that limp that we've ended up with send us not away from God but back to God, to say, oh God, I need you. And I'm going to stop trying to do it in my own strength and build my own paradise, but I'm going to ask you for it. And not put it off and say, well, when I'm better and when life's sorted and when the difficulties have gone and the interruptions have gone, or when I've had a vision of angels, then I'll come to God. But to come to Him now. To come to Him right now when fear looms, when life frustrates, when it's difficult. That's when we need to find the face of God. Not to fight those things on our own, in our own cunning and plotting and put God off till later when it's peaceful. No, we need to cling to God now when we're under pressure. God's using that pressure to drive us to Him. Jacob says, I've seen the face of God. That's ultimately all we need. That's the blessing we need. But we need to submit. We need to stop fighting back. Just think about ourselves for a moment as we go into some prayer, some worship. Where am I fighting back with God? Where am I resisting? Where am I saying, no, I'm having it my way. I want this and I'm going to get it. And I'm going to do it. And I'm going to sort it. And maybe I'll talk to you later. Where are we still wrestling? Where is God then wrestling with us and saying, no, don't do it your way. Come to me for it. Ask me for it. I'm the provider. I'm the one who's got everything you need. Jacob's not learned what Abraham learned earlier on. God will provide. Where in our lives are we still living in our own strength, building our own paradise, putting God off, pushing Him to one side, when actually we need to cling? We need to surrender. We need to say, okay, God, I lay that down. Not lay down desire. Not become, oh, well, I don't care anymore. I don't need anything. I don't need anybody. Just become passive. No, desire is good. It's just where you get it from. What we've got to lay down is the attempt to do it ourselves and then bring our desires to God and say, I'm clinging to you now. Will you do this? Will you bless me? Will you give me this? I'm going to put my energies into holding on to God rather than into constructing my own paradise and arranging my own blessing. This is a deep, deep story. It's about Jacob, but it's about you and me. Every one of us is in this wrestle. Every one of us is somewhere in this story. And every one of us needs to learn to stop fighting with Him and just to cling. Let's pray.